We've learned about sampling methods and about variables. Those pieces of the research process come together in what we call the research design and methods. You might have already noticed I also like to use metaphors and examples. When I'm learning, it helps me be able to relate new information to something I already know, and research suggests I'm not alone in that. And you might have also noticed I tend to use food-based metaphors. I like food. In this case, though, the idea of building also helps. Just like specific cooking and building projects have different goals, so does research. And just like cooking and building projects vary in their complexity, so do research projects. Each type of project has a purpose, though. Complicated does not mean better. In the case of research, we tend to talk about 4 types of goals: describing behavior, the basic what happened and or when; explaining behavior, the why; predicting, getting into more of this and that happen together; and determining causes, being able to say if, then. Research design varies with the goals of the project and describes how we combine sampling and types of variables for a particular study. The research design would be like the menu for meals or plans for a building. It defines the components and how they'll come together. There are 3 broad categories of designs: non-experimental, experimental, and quasi-experimental. Non-experimental designs observe or measure variables without manipulating variables to create differences between participants. Remember, they might manipulate a variable to create a context for measurement. They can only help with goals related to describing, explaining, and predicting. Determining the causes of behavior requires an experiment where the researcher manipulates a variable to create differences between groups of participants. Participants are also randomly assigned to different groups. In other words, all participants have an equal chance of being included in any level of the variables. Sometimes it's not possible or ethical to assign participants to different levels of a group, though. We call that a quasi-experimental design when it has the characteristics of experiments without random assignment. For example, if a researcher wants to study whether teenage smokers have higher levels of other risk behaviors, it wouldn't be ethical to assign teenagers to smoke. One of the things you'll hear and see me mention a lot is the importance of using the term cause accurately when we're talking about research. The video you watched earlier in the class about correlation and causation helped you think about why it's important not to confuse the two. When we talk about research designs, then, it's important to understand what they help us know. More specifically, non-experimental designs that don't create different groups by manipulating a variable, don't allow us to make claims about cause and effect. That's because the process leaves too many possibilities for which variable causes the other, or for other variables to be involved, as the figures in this slide show. The process of manipulating a variable in an experiment does allow us to make claims about cause and effect. You might remember the ideas of independent variables and dependent variables from other classes. Keep in mind that the independent variable is the one that is manipulated. So if we're talking about non-experimental studies, we won't have an independent variable since we only measure variables in those designs. We also interpret quasi-experimental designs as being about cause and effect and talk about a similar idea of an independent variable, but in that case it's the one that is naturally occurring to create groups. It all comes together. The goals, the design, the components all come together in the research method, the process of collecting data. Just like cooks and builders use different techniques depending on their goals and components, so do researchers. There's also a parallel when we think about how well thought out the process was and how well it's carried out and how well it turns out. Sometimes recipes seem like a good idea at first, but the end result is just not appealing. Sometimes the recipe's fine, but the ingredients were measured wrong, or combined in the wrong order, or the final dish isn't cooked long enough. You get the idea. Things like that can happen in research too if we don't put thought into the design and the method.